Welcome everyone to another edition of When Movies Were Good down here in Melbourne, Australia with Matt and Rachel, I meant to say, not Matt, with my special guest star and my longtime friend, Matt.
Yep, you got that right in one.
So I'm Rachel and Matt's Matt, just to clarify. Sorry, I think it's been a long week for everyone. It's getting towards Christmas.
It's that time of year.
Yeah, it is. What we call silly season, or there's probably some other words that a lot of people would put in front of it. So how are you doing tonight, Matt, now that I've cleared that up?
Yeah, good. I've been Christmas baking this weekend, so I feel like I've worn an extra tire upon the tire.
I know, it's a bit like that. You really have to be very careful of what you eat this time of year, but then that takes all the fun out of Christmas, I think, for most people. So, well, we've got a few weeks of it and then back onto our proverbial diets as everyone is. So tonight, Matt and I, and as you know, When Movies Are Good is not so much a review show. It's two friends having a discussion about when movies were good, the classic era of movies. So we're talking about silent movies right up until 1959. And we're doing a Ronald Reagan special just in light of all of the political shenanigans going on in the US right now. We decided to do a Ronald Reagan double. So, of course, Ronald Reagan was the president of the US, but he was also quite a famous classic film actor. Were you familiar with much of his work, Matt? Or
I hadn't really seen much of it. He hadn't become as big a star as the likes of William Holden and those other figures of the time, although he was becoming, I think, quite a significant middle grade actor in a lot of those homely American films. And yes, I understand why it would have been shocking at the time for a fairly prominent actor to be suddenly running for office. But when you see a lot of the films he was in, where there was sort of a wholesome Americana, you think it probably wasn't that hard a pill to swallow.
No, he was definitely that sort of Midwestern and very good-looking, charismatic person. So just a little bit of facts on Ronald Wilson Reagan, aka he was also known as Dutch, which was a childhood nickname, and also the Gipper from one of his most famous films, where he uttered the famous line, "Go and win one for the Gipper." So but he was quite a famous actor. So when he did make the transition to politics in the 1960s and 70s, first becoming the governor of California and then going on to the presidency, and he'd had other political roles before then, but it probably was a shock to a lot of people, but not so much to him, because I think, you know, being an actor sort of prepares you for one of the greatest stages of all, and that is politics, because most of it's acting. So.
And he would have been among that first generation of politicians who really spent a lot of time in front of the camera.
Yes, that's true. And also he was a spokesman for General Electric, and apparently a lot of his political underpinnings and sort of the things that formed his worldview, because he started off as a Democrat, then he went over to the Republican side, was all the travelling he did as a spokesman for General Electric when he was working for them.
Yeah, it's interesting learning how different politicians sort of grind their early boots. Churchill, I believe, unlike a lot of people of his class, spent a lot of time in rather gritty union debates, so he knew how to talk rough when he had to.
Yeah, so I think that's the same with Ronald Reagan, because he went out and actually spent a lot of time with the people and speaking to them, and I guess being an actor is one thing and being separated by that sort of fourth wall, but going out into society was probably one of the best things he ever did. So just going through very, very briefly just some of the things, because he's the thing that links these two films together, because he is a supporting role in both of the films. He was considered more of a B film actor, so even in some of the better films that he did, he was sort of the more supporting role. So it was George Gipp in Newt Rockney All American. That's where Win One for the Gipper comes from, because he played the Gipper, I think it was. I haven't actually seen that one, but I'm curious to see that film. But he said that his favourite acting role was one that he did in 1942's King's Row, where he plays a double amputee who recites the line, "Where's the rest of me?" And then he called one of his autobiographies that, "Where's the rest of me?" So he actually had a few good roles in some of these films. His last film was The Killers in 1964, and then he went on to do some TV, and then he did officially retire and then start going into politics. So I've always thought he is one of the people that has led one of the most interesting lives because, and I guess the other thing I respect about him as well is if, no offense, but there's a lot of, to people out there that like modern actors, I'm not so much into them, but they spout off all this political stuff, but none of them actually have the guts to actually back it up and get out of acting and go in and do it. So one thing you have to say about him is that, he actually did retire from acting and actually went out and ran and did it.
Yeah, it was quite a shock because I'm certain it would to the system because I'm certain that he'd have well known that it wasn't a common course he was going down. Like even simply going against his own first wife in terms of the path of the future he wanted to go down.
Yeah, because wasn't she was a Republican and he was a Democrat apparently.
Not even party politics. Yeah. She straight out didn't want to be a politician's wife, as far as I know.
Okay, yeah.
And it is a hard choice to live with when you're suddenly having to. Like, my personal philosophy is, unless you're a card-carrying active member of a political party, couple who are otherwise functional don't necessarily need to talk about politics.
Yeah.
But it becomes different when you're a professional in it.
Yeah, that's very true. So I think obviously, his second wife, Nancy, who was Nancy Davis, she must have been very on board with it because she essentially kind of gave up her career as well, and then she did become the politician's wife, whereas Jane Wyman continued to act, well, up until 1990, until Falcon Crest finished, so...
Well, even if you're not surrendering your own career, it's a big responsibility to be the supportive voice to a person in office.
Yeah, that's true.
And of course, it's a rather heavy, greasy pole. You don't necessarily know there's going to be a big job at the end.
Yeah, that's very true. So we'll go into one of, not his earliest film, but one of his earlier films, and he was working with quite a good cast in this film. So it's Santa Fe Trail, made in 1940. So directed by Michael Curtis, who is well known for directing Casablanca and many other great films. No, don't get me started. And actually one of the films we're doing next time he did as well, I just realised then. So we had the great Errol Flynn, one of our compatriots. We had Olivia de Havilland, of course, who's one of our favourites, Raymond Massey and Ronald Reagan, and Alan Hale Sr., and I'm pretty sure I'm familiar with his son, Alan Hale Jr., who was in Gilligan's Island playing the skipper. I saw the face and I thought, hang on, that's not the same Alan Hale. I think that obviously they're related. So
Hollywood's a small family.
So written by Robert Buckner. It's a sort of like, it is a historical film with a lot of artistic license from what I was reading. It's about it's set in the pre-Civil War era. It's about the abolitionist John Brown and his campaign against slavery to the American Civil War. And there's a subplot with, in this film, Ronald Reagan's actually playing Custer, who was very famous, became very famous not only in the Civil War but afterwards, and J.E.B. Stewart, and it's sort of like a romantic subplot where they're competing for the hand of Kit Holiday, who's played by Olivia de Havilland. So what were your thoughts on this film?
Well, for one thing, like you said, it has an excellent cast, and even if Ronald Reagan didn't become a superstar in his own, the fact that he was playing right up next to Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland does say something about some of the stature he reached.
Yeah.
And I think it's an excellent Western in terms of many of the action scenes. I did find some of the delving into politics borderline. I did find it to be sort of borderline offensive the way they were put, because personally I'm going to be controversial. I think Gone with the Wind actually did a pretty good job of balancing out the perspectives. I do not think this movie does.
No.
The way it shows it does kind of make it an obviously valid thing that for many people the idea of emancipation was an ideological mission they were following, they weren't necessarily that excited about the practical steps of integrating all the elements of American society into the same land after the war afterwards. And you have those rather unpleasant things said by supposedly ex-slaves about missing the old country.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose it's everything's in its context. I suppose back then, perhaps the film was coming from a certain viewpoint that was more acceptable then. It can be a bit jarring to watch certain films now and their dialogue. I kind of just tend to let it wash over me because I think these films were a product of their time, and also I guess they're playing the opposing side to the abolitionist in this film. So I suppose there sort of had to be a certain amount of confronting dialogue because the country really was divided at that point. So
it isn't. I have no issue with an evil character or an evil or wrong side of a story saying the wrong things as pertain to their role, but it's when it's the sort of when they're trying to justify going back to the old ways.
Yeah, that's true. I think it was just, I mean, as much as we think that things are divided now, not just the US, but all countries around the world, I suppose it's got nothing on what life was like back then.
Yeah,
because it
of course the overall message of the film is a noble one, but it's, I think even by the standards of the time, it was clunky in how it was delivered.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, and also the film, from what I was reading, is not historically accurate, so a lot of these people sort of placed into this story, like Custer wouldn't have known these people, and Jefferson Davis wasn't the head of the military academy at that time, or he was for one group of people but not for the others. So I mean, it just must have been such an amazing time to live in history, and very confronting too. I mean, if you were a slave, if you weren't, if you a new immigrant there. I mean, it was really the Wild West in a lot of senses. And as, they say in the film, I mean, they weren't a world power at that stage. They were considered a developing country. They weren't to the status of the European, countries. So
exactly. And of course, in retrospect, the ideals and construction projects of American Washington and stuff have a lot more glory because of the financial authority that America has had for the last 100 years, but it was much more ideological back then.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed the film because I felt the film moved along from one thing to the next thing. Whether it was historically accurate or not, that's fine. Sometimes it's fine just to watch things for the enjoyment of it, and then if it piques your interest, then you can go off and maybe find something a bit more representative of it to watch, whether that be a documentary or something else.
Well, I think part of why science fiction has succeeded on an epic scale so much in the last 20 to 30 years is that it fills a lot of the excitement and the conflict type scenarios brought about in westerns, but in a time when people know they had to be much more sensitive about historical detail. In science fiction, they can be they could create a lot more fantasy and get away with it as opposed to back in early westerns, which this film effectively is. Creating a rather fictitious historical reenactment, which is really just providing transitions between big battle scenes.
Yeah. I think the big battle scenes were done pretty well. I mean, and the subplot was okay, sort of. What did you think of Olivia de Havilland in this film?
I like her presence as I do in all her films, although I think in this particular one, the romance conflict, it was a bit too separated out from the main storyline. It's almost a similar problem they had in Raise the Titanic, another film we both have interesting thoughts on.
Yeah.
So when the scriptwriter feels obliged to add in this extra romance plot, which just gets it more confusing.
And I could, as much as I love Errol Flynn, I could pick up his Aussie accent a little bit. Could you hear his accent a bit in this, or?
Well, I wasn't really on the ear out for it, and maybe that was just the audio quality on the version I was hearing, but even then, the Australian accent in those days was a lot more Anglo-ish than it is now.
It's a lot more English sounding. Yeah, he definitely, I mean, he didn't sound Aussie like you and I do, but he yeah, I was listening there and I thought, gee, I didn't think that person grew up in Australia. So, I mean, you forget that, I mean, I guess a lot of his roles were sort of historical roles, and that sort of generic sort of Anglo-ish sort of accent that he had for a lot of his films worked quite well. But in this one, he is playing an American. So I did actually, but I'm if I know someone is Australian or originally from here, I'm always sort of half listening to hear whether that I can pick up their accent, even if they're doing an American accent. Like, I always listen for Nicole Kidman, I always listen for, you know, whoever it may be. And sometimes, especially in their early films, you can hear it, yeah.
In Sean Connery's case, you never had to listen too hard.
Yeah, that's true enough. I enjoyed the Santa Fe Trail. Ronald Reagan was a supporting role, but he was, you know, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot better films about Custer that you can watch, and obviously his battles with the indigenous people of the US. But it was kind of there was a lot of really big, interesting characters in this film. But it was sort of a film that was a bit more of an action film as well. So they weren't really going to be fleshed out as well as you could in some sort of period drama, whether they wanted to do that back then.
Yeah, it's much in a similar way to what Robin Hood was. And I've got to say, Robin Hood, I definitely think they managed to put those elements together much more successfully. Who knows? It's a very delicate balance to get the sort of the plots of the requisite romance and of the time with the action scenes. But you can easily tell, though, why Santa Fe Trail was, I believe it was the highest grossing film of that year.
Yes. Yeah, no, it definitely, it would entertain the masses, for sure. So that film was made, Ronald Reagan made that film in 1940, and he made it in a great company, one of the greatest directors of all time and some of the greatest actors of all time. He was in fantastic company in that film, and he held himself in good regard in that film as well. So if we jump 10 years later, so Ronald's been making films all through the 40s, and now we're into 1950. So he's playing, you know, the more, I wouldn't say middle-aged, but I guess he was in his 40s in this film. His character certainly was anyway, because he was the father of a teenage daughter and a younger son. So we're now going to jump to 1950s Louisa, and I have to say I really enjoyed this film.
Me too.
This sort of film's really up my alley in terms of that slapstick comedy, lots of fun. I thought, let me just go into it now. I absolutely thought Spring Byington was fantastic. I'm not really familiar with a lot of her work. I have to say, I think I heard the name once or something like that. But I thought she was fantastic, and so Ronald was sort of like one of the supporting actors in this film. I mean, still one of the main parts. But Charles Coburn and Edmund Gwenn, who played Henry and Abel, I thought they were utterly fantastic. There was a young Piper Laurie, because I know her from some of her work in the 70s and 80s, in this film playing the daughter. I was like, oh my God, that is Piper Laurie. So I had a great time watching this film. So Matt, just really quickly, I'll just run over for the audience what this film's about. It might pique their interest a little bit. So it does sort of start off with Ronald Reagan's character. He plays a character called Harold or Hal, and he's a successful architect. So at the time he's got his elder, although 65 now is not considered elderly, but back then I guess it was. And now it's sort of like, yeah, you're an older person, but if you're in good health, you're still going strong. You could be still working full time. You could be still, but back then that was considered old, you know. Like
Michelangelo called himself old at 42.
Yeah. Oh, did he? Yeah.
Yeah.
So he urges his elderly widowed mother, Louisa, so that's Spring Byington, to find something to do besides tormenting his wife, played by Ruth Hussey, his son, who's played by Jimmy Hunt, and teen daughter, played by the fantastic Piper Laurie. But soon the Norton household is turned upside down when Louisa starts double dating the grocer, so the English grocer, played by Edmund Gwenn, and then Hal's boss gets into the mix, Abel, who I thought was hilarious, and then he becomes smitten with Louisa as well, and basically there's a lot of slapstick, a lot of fun, and eventually, after lots of shenanigans and hiccups and the family fighting and carrying on and all this other stuff, then she finally makes a choice, and all's well that ends well.
In a way, it's almost every episode of Bewitched.
Yeah, basically.
Minus the magic.
This is really reminded me of one of the sort of 50s sitcoms. It was just like a longer version of one of the 50s sitcoms.
Do you know what really said it's time for me, though?
What?
That when Reagan gives his son a chemistry set, it's the radioactive detection version. Because only in the 50s would they be teaching kids to detect radiation.
Yeah.
Disclaimer, I believe it was very, very minute doses, less than microwave.
Oh my gosh. It was actually nominated for one Academy Award for Best Sound. So, and I think Spring Byington was nominated for a Golden Globe. So it was it was from Universal. It was a very well received picture. So, I can't say much more about this other than I really enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty well paced. I thought Ronald Reagan was very good. He was a good choice in the role. But the three leads, Louisa and the two boys, made the film.
Yeah, it's a lot is always said naturally about the hierarchy of gender in film at the time. But you also realise in roles like Reagan's, it could also be quite restrictive on the other way because he sort of could only play that very stern screwball father.
That's right, yeah. He was definitely the straight guy. He was like Darren in Bewitched, if we're going down that.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, and but I thought that...
Or your favourite dude, Larry Havilland.
I was actually, as Matt got here, I was watching this great video that was shot at the White House in 1987 when Larry Hagman went to visit Nancy Reagan. Unfortunately, I'm sure he would have talked to Ronnie while he was there. But from my understanding, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone out there knows, but I believe that Mary Martin, Larry Hagman's mother, and she did spend a bit of time in Hollywood. She was predominantly a stage actress, working on the West End and on Broadway, but she did spend some time in Hollywood, and I believe that's where she met Nancy Davis, and she probably met Ronald Reagan there as well when he was with Jane Wyman, so...
Well, when you write your eventual biography of Larry Hagman, you'll have to confirm the details.
I think I will, but it was just, it was such a great moment in time because I grew up with Ronald Reagan, so I'm a bit older than Matt. And when I was my earliest memories of any president was Ronald Reagan. So I was a really little girl when he was inaugurated, and then by the time he finished his term in 1988, I was actually in my first year of high school. So I didn't know anybody else but him for most of my childhood as being the president of the US. And I once, back in the day when I ran for parliament, I was giving some speech and I started going off on this Ronald Reagan tangent. And everyone's like, what does that have to do with anything happening here in Melbourne? And will my bins get taken out next week? Because they haven't been.
I don't know. I just wanted a chance to mention him.
So he definitely, because he's, when I think of Ronald Reagan, it's not so much the Reagan that we're seeing in these two fun films that I wouldn't say Santa Fe Trail was fun, but it was entertaining. These films that we watch, but I always see him as the older version that I knew when he was the president, because that's just where my memory goes to straight away. And I obviously have such fond memories of the 80s because I was a little kid growing up in the 80s, and it was... Yeah, I don't know. I just think I compare it to how kids are growing up now, and I just prefer it back then. But I think most people, as they get older, probably think that. So.
Yeah, well, certainly it was kind of that last era when politicians were professionals, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, or I think at least there was a bit more respect between, because he wasn't particularly, when he came into politics, he was kind of considered a cowboy and considered, this guy's going to blow the world up and all this sort of stuff. And they didn't like his economic plan. And I remember all that. And he actually, when he was extremely popular for a period there, and then towards the end, like 1988 or so, there was other scandals engulfing his administration and stuff. So he sort of had the highs and lows of politics, probably as the governor of California and then as the president. And at that time, before Donald Trump came along, he was the oldest president that was inaugurated because he was 69 and Trump was 70. But as I said, he always seemed a lot older than what Trump does. I suppose it could be Trump's hair or something, although Ronald Reagan, I think, coloured his hair, but... yeah.
What about the skin colour there?
Well, a lot of politicians do actually wear fake tan on their face, and a lot of them, like I was reading that President Kennedy used to wear, those sun visors where they sit there with the mirrored sort of thing that comes up at your face, and a lot of them did actually wear makeup, especially the more that they started going on TV with debates and stuff. I just think, maybe a certain person should...
They probably miss the days of black and white television.
Yeah, or perhaps find a more suitable tone for the face or something like that. But I think most politicians, just by matter of course, have to wear makeup. But
mind you, I'm quite into black and white photography, and
yes.
Blue filters actually work quite well on skin tones. So maybe they should have painted their faces blue for the black and white camera.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting, but just ultimately, this second film, I did enjoy it more than the Santa Fe Trail. I just thought it, because it was so much slapstick, so much humour, lots of fun, and double entendres, people getting the wrong idea. That wrestling fight that they had at the dance off that they were going to was hilarious. And I just thought it was just good old-fashioned, family sort of fun, something that the whole family would have gone to on a Saturday afternoon at the pictures to go and see. So I'm glad we chose that little film. That was just something that Matt and I could access easily to watch. So we thought we'd pick that one and the other one. There's lots of other films of his that I would have liked to have chosen, but we could find those two, so we went for them. So I'm glad we actually got a chance to see that, and I'm really keen to actually see some of his other films, especially the one about the amputee and stuff, and see what his sort of acting chops are like in that.
And one of the co-stars that I'd like to learn more about his material, Edmund Gwenn. I know he did quite a few, including one or two of Hitchcock's. Hitchcock was a big fan of his.
Oh yeah, definitely need to sort of explore, and also Spring Byington as well. I'm just looking at her. She received a nomination for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her role as Penelope in You Can't Take It With You, 1938. So she was definitely a very accomplished actress. So as Matt and I go through this journey more, there's just literally hundreds of films to watch with all of these great, fantastic actors in there. So as we said, it can definitely be a lifelong hobby for sure. For sure. We've only scratched the surface of it. A vocation, definitely. So it's something to keep us going. Anyway, so ultimately we had a good time watching these films. And as we sort of segue on to just finishing up with you for the night, thanks for joining us again. We've decided, as we're approaching Christmas, and what a funny old year 2020 has been, but oh well, maybe Christmas will bring some changes with it. Matt suggested we definitely have to do a Christmas double, and I was losing track at the time, so of course I agreed to it.
We all were.
Yeah. So we're doing, one of the ultimate Christmas movies, It's a Wonderful Life, 1946, James Stewart, directed by Frank Capra. And then one, that'll get me going because I'm going to start singing all the songs, and that's White Christmas, 1954, directed again by the great Michael Curtis and starring Bing Crosby. Rosemary Clooney was Vera Lynn and the great Danny Kaye.
And maybe we will settle the great debate once and for all on whether or not It's a Wonderful Life is actually a Christmas movie, because it was kind of the Breaking Bad, really, of its time in terms of how you define a Christmas film.
Is it a bit like it's like, don't they often ask if Die Hard is considered one of the great...
Oh, so that's what I meant, sorry, not Breaking Bad, Die Hard. Yeah, it's a bit long before Die Hard was the figure of debate. It's a Wonderful Life was a different one in terms of how you define a Christmas movie.
Yeah.
So we may settle that conflict once and for all.
Okay, yeah, it'd be nice to sort of have some parallels between them. I'm looking forward to, It's a Wonderful Life. I've been meaning to sit down. I've watched bits and pieces, and I've seen the end scene many times, but I've needed to sit down, and of course I've seen bits and pieces of White Christmas, but have never sat down and watched the whole thing from start to finish. So I look forward to doing that. So now, just another segue about my computer. It's still being fixed, so my grand plans of starting up another website that we can share a lot of information on externally from Facebook and stuff still hasn't become a reality, but hopefully third time lucky with the warranty repair, and maybe they'll give me another computer.
Third time's the charm.
So we shall see another day another day down at the store where I bought it from, and we'll see what they say next time. So anyway, but Matt, if you wanted to just run everyone just quickly through social media, which we will develop more, we just haven't had the opportunity to yet.
Yes, well, if you're coming in from another planet, you may not have heard of these things called social media channels, including Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Basically, they are different birds and other colourful logos incorporated into online platforms for exchanging information, and like many other organisations and creative endeavours, we take advantage of their presence. So you can look for our appropriate handles at When Movies Were Good on all those stations. And
thank you so much for that, Matt.
You're welcome.
So until we see and hear of you guys next time, I'm Rachel.
I'm Matthew.
And we're watching good movies. Thank you and good night.